One of my favorite woodworking projects is end grain cutting boards, and that's for three reasons. They're beautiful, they're functional, and they're a great way to use up scraps. A lot of the cutting board videos that I see on YouTube, folks use full-size pieces of lumber, and that's fine. I prefer to use scraps and cutoffs for mine because there is really no other project that I can think of that's a better way of using up scraps like these. Now, one thing that I have not yet done on this channel is a tutorial, so that's what I'm going to do today. I'm going to make an end grain cutting board out of these scraps of lumber and some more that I can find lying around. I'm going to make what's called a basket weave pattern. Now, the lumber that I'm going to use is a little bit controversial for end grain cutting boards. This is poplar. Poplar is technically a hardwood, but it is pretty soft. And a lot of people say that poplar isn't really good to use for cutting boards. I don't really know that I agree with that. I see a lot of poplar cutting boards for sale, and I've seen a lot of posts from people who say that they've made and used poplar end grain cutting boards, and they've held up just fine over the years. I've even seen a lot of people say that they have used cutting boards made from pine or fir, and they've also held well over many years, even though those are softwoods. So poplar should be just fine. A lot of people are turned off by the kind of greenish color of it, but this is going to have a contrasting darker wood in the pattern, so I think it's going to look great. So let's get started. I'm going to put the cut list for this project right up here. I'm going to need 8 pieces of poplar that are 1.5 inches wide, 2 inches thick, and 21 inches long. Then I'm going to need 16 pieces of the contrasting wood. I think I'm going to use sapele. Those are going to be 1.5 inches wide, 1/4 of an inch thick, and also 21 inches long. That should end up with a cutting board that is 12 inches wide and 18 inches long and about 1.5 inches thick. I'm going to start by milling up the poplar over at the jointer. Okay, I now have one face and one edge that are jointed 90 degrees, so I'm going to take them over to the table saw and mill them up to size. Now, I understand that not everybody who has access to scraps will also have a jointer. There are plenty of videos floating around YouTube of how to joint boards just like this using tools that you probably do have, including a table saw and a planer. With my pieces all cut to a uniform 1.5 inches wide, now I will bring them over to the planer and plane them all down to a uniform 1 inch thick. If you'd like to support the channel and you want one of these digital readouts for your DW735 planer, check out the link in the description for my Etsy shop and you can get one of your own. Okay, my poplar is all milled down to uniform size, and if you could see down here, there are actually 10 pieces instead of 8. I saw a couple of knots while I was milling them down, so now I have a couple of extra so I can pick the ones that I want. For the contrasting color, I'm going to use this Brazilian cherry hardwood flooring. I was going to use sapele, but I don't actually have enough that's the right size, so this is plan B. I'm going to start by first planing off the grooves on one side and the finish on the other side, and then I'll resaw them down to about 1/4 inch thick, slightly oversized, and then I'll plane them down to a uniform 1/4 inch. Next, I'll cut off the tongues and the grooves. With the tongues cut off, I don't actually need to cut off the grooves on the other side. I now need to cut 1.5 inch strips that I will then resaw at the bandsaw. I should be able to get 2 pieces out of each of these planks. I don't think I'll be able to get 3. Well, that didn't go exactly as planned. Unfortunately, I'm still learning how to resaw, so my resawing was very uneven, and even more unfortunately, my drum sander is, we'll just say, unreliable. You can see it was burning a lot, and then 2 different sheets of sandpaper shredded. But that's okay. I can still glue the cherry onto the poplar, and then I will redimension everything once the glue dries. So here is what the glue up is going to look like. Each piece of poplar gets 2 pieces of cherry. Now that the glue is dry, I will clean up the glue squeeze out on both sides. And now to get the bottoms flush, I will run all of these over the jointer. Now that one side is cut flush, I'll take them back to the table saw, cut this side flush, turn them 90 degrees, and then cut this side square. I cut the pieces of cherry just slightly oversized on purpose to give me a little bit of wiggle room. So this way, the piece measures 1.46 inches, and this side, it's 1.51 inches. The cherry on this side is a little bit narrower than this side, so I'll actually bring it over to the planer and take a little bit off of this side. Okay, all the pieces are now milled up perfectly square, so now I'm going to flip every other one, and we'll hopefully start to see that pattern emerging. Now I will glue them up in this configuration and let that glue dry. I have let the glue dry for 24 hours, and now I'll take off the clamps and do the next set of cuts. Actually, before I do the next set of cuts, I'm going to put it through the planer to get both sides flat. The next step is going to be to square up one end and then cut it into strips in this direction. However thick I cut these strips, that's how thick my cutting board will end up. I was planning on making this cutting board 1.5 inches thick, but after doing some back of the napkin calculations, if I cut these into 1.5 inch wide strips, I'm not going to have quite enough on this end. So I'm going to cut them just slightly narrower than 1.5 inches wide. Well, as usually happens with back of the napkin measurements, my measurements were off. I actually have too many pieces here now. I only needed 13 of these to make an 18-inch wide cutting board, so that's not the end of the world. These 5 pieces I can just use for another cutting board in the future. So to make this an end grain cutting board, I will flip all of these pieces 90 degrees one way. And now for the magic, I'm going to flip every other piece. And now we can see that basket weave pattern. And here's what that pattern looks like a little closer up. The next step is to do one final glue up. And one thing I forgot to mention and forgot to do is to put an extra piece of sacrificial something, in this case it's white oak, at one end. And the reason for that will hopefully become clear soon. I've allowed the glue to cure for 24 hours, so now there is one final thing to do. And that involves something that's a little controversial when it comes to cutting boards, which is putting an end grain cutting board through a thickness planer. Now, there are some people who believe that putting an end grain cutting board through a thickness planer risks the whole thing blowing up if there's a catch. Now, I've put many end grain cutting boards through the planer, taking very light passes, and I haven't had any problems yet. But that's exactly why I put this piece of wood at the very end. As the board is going through the planer, there's going to be chip out on the end here, and I don't want that to be on the board itself. So this sacrificial piece is going to take all of that chip out. Now, as I said, I'm going to be taking extremely light passes on this, perhaps a 64th or even 128th of an inch with each pass on each side. Now, I'm comfortable doing this, but if you aren't, don't do it. You can use a drum sander, a random orbital sander, or a belt sander, but on end grain, it's going to take a lot longer. All right, the planing is all done. It is nice and smooth on both sides. As you can see, it did not explode. But what you can also see is that chip out that I was talking about on that trailing edge. So this sacrificial piece took all of that. So the next thing I'm going to do is run it along one edge on the jointer to straighten up one edge. Now I can run this straight edge along my table saw fence to clean up the opposite edge. And now I'll use my crosscut sled to trim off that sacrificial piece. The last thing to do before sanding is to route a finger groove on both ends using this core box bit on the router table. I have the core box bit installed in my router table. I'm going to do a plunge cut like this. I have a mark here on my fence to start the cut and here to end the cut. It doesn't have to be super precise, but that will give me a finger hole that is about 4 inches wide, which is just a little bit wider than my hand. That bit always leaves a little bit of burning, so I'll clean that up with some sandpaper before I round over the edges. Well, I know I said that routing these finger holds would be the last thing to do before sanding, but there's actually one more thing, which is, as I mentioned before, putting a round over on all of the edges. I'm going to use this very small round over bit in my router table. I'm using a small one because a larger round over would just reduce the usable work area. And now, sanding. Now, I'm not sure if it's going to come out on camera, but hopefully you can see these lines that were left by my planer. I've already gone over this with 80 grit, but the best way that I found to deal with those lines is to spray the whole board with water that raises the grain and lets me sand those lines down, and they disappear pretty quickly. All right, the water has dried, the grain is very much raised, so I'll sand that back down now. All right, that is looking and feeling much better. I'll now go up to 120 grit, then 150, and finish with 220. All right, the cutting board is done. It is sanded up to 220 grit, and it looks and feels great. So the next thing to do is finish it. There are lots of different finishes that folks use for cutting boards. My favorite finish is mineral oil. This isn't any special mineral oil at all. This is just Walmart brand mineral oil. You can buy butcher block oil or cutting board oil online, but it's exactly the same as what's in here, except this costs about a third as much as those other brands. The main reason I like it is because it's so simple. I just pour it on the board, I let it sit for an hour or two, and then wipe off any excess. If any of the board still looks dry, I just reapply the mineral oil and repeat the process. After the board has soaked up as much oil as it can, I then apply some beeswax, and I'm done. So I'm going to put the board in this plastic bin and pour the oil on it. This is always my favorite part of making any cutting board, so I'm going to pull in really close so you can see what it looks like. Once again, it is the next day and all of the oil has absorbed into the board. So I will now wipe off any excess with a paper towel. Now the very last thing to do is to apply the board butter. Now this is a homemade combination of mineral oil and beeswax. I made this probably about 5 years ago when I started turning bowls, and I still have about a third of this container left. A little bit goes a long way. When I do run out of this, I will make a video on how to make this board butter. Applying it is very simple. I take a little bit on a paper towel, wipe it into the board, and then wait about an hour and again wipe off the excess. I let the board sit like this on its edge for an hour, and now I will just wipe off any excess wax. So that's my process for making a basket weave end grain cutting board. If you enjoyed this video, please consider sharing it with someone you like. If you didn't enjoy it, maybe share it with someone you don't like. Also, please remember to hit the notification bell, leave a comment, hit the like button, and I hope to see you next time.